I think the Mitsurugi deck a lot stronger when people cut it from Lockbird from the main deck, in addition to the Murakumo being pretty good into the Vanquish Soul K9 board. But I think Mitsu on its own can be a bit underwhelming, so I decided to include a K9 package to up its ceiling. Let's talk about it. Starting off with the main deck, I have 3 copies of Habakiri. Habakiri is your main starter card in the Mitsu deck, so of course we run 3 of him. Additionally, the Mitsu rituals are also level 8, which is quite prevalent for a card in our extra deck, to help us bridge the Mitsus into K9. Then I have 1 copy of Murakumo. I decided to go with a slightly smaller Mitsurugi engine in this deck, as I also have the K9s, and I want to play hand traps, so I can't fit all the Mitsu cards in the main deck. So I decided to go with the bare minimum that I felt was needed for game 1, and I even take out a lot of them when I go second, as the Mitsu game plan changes quite a lot when you go first, as opposed to when you go second. But for going first in game 1, I think the Mitama is actually a really good end piece, because even if they break your board, the amount of follow-up you get from the Mitama, bringing back a Mitsurugi every single time they special summon a monster, is often just too much for your opponent to overcome. Thus, the Mitama when you go first can essentially create a resource loop that gives you enough longevity to stay in the game, even against decks like Jummy or Vanquish Soul K9, which can feel like they just print cards at times. Thanks to Mitama, we can do the same. But this card does little to nothing when you go second, therefore I take this out, along with some other engine pieces. Since I'm also putting in multiple Molsharmis, I get to draw to 6, and the entire game plan just shifts to summoning Murakumo and regeking away their field, and either going for game or grinding them out from there. As such, the Mitama, being an end piece, is not as prevalent. And I'm not trying to draw like 3 Mitsu cards when I go second, because they're just redundant. These cards are the best when you see the 1 starter, and maybe 1 extender when they hand trap it. Or something like Ritual Spell plus Ritual Monster, which also beats 2 hand traps a lot of the time. Then for the non-rituals, I have 2 copies of Aramasa, 1 Saji, 1 Kusanagi, and 1 Serpent. Serpent is also one of those cards that become a lot worse in this type of deck when you go second. This is not like Raizeel Mitsurugi, where you use your Mitsu cards to break apart their field, and then you either bait another negate by going duo drive, or making some other rank 4 play that aims to beat their negations. In this deck, there's no natural bridge from Mitsu into K9. As such, you use your rank 4 or rank 8 plays to try to dig for those cards, and that is mostly prevalent when you go first. As such, the Nitrate Serpent is just another brick in your deck, and that is something that I usually take out when I go second, unlike in Raizeel Mitsurugi. So when you play this type of Mitsurugi deck, as opposed to Raizeel Mitsu, you have to understand that the cards function differently because the goal is different, and as such, you also use the cards in a different manner, because you're just trying to reach a different goal. But similar to Mitama, in game 1 going first, I like having the Nitrate Serpent in my deck. And that is it for the Mitsurugi monsters. For the Mitsu spells, I have 3 copies of Ritual. I think the Mitsu deck is at its best when you can either go draw phase Prayers to tribute something, or go main phase 1 first action Mitsurugi Ritual, as this card just forces them to interact, especially when you summon Murakumo and try to regeki their field. And this deck kinda plays like a Kashtira deck, where you really like them to interact with you, because that kinda just turns on your cards. So in a Kashtira deck, for example, when the opponent activates a monster effect, then you get to utilize Fenrir or Unicorn to banish something. And if you play Thrust or Talons, you can also activate those to grab additional engine cards and push through what they have. In this deck, if your opponent hand traps you or uses something like a graveyard effect, that just turns on your K9 cards and makes your engine that much better. So sometimes with the K9 cards, as well as with Thrust and Talent-esque cards, you play the game in such a way where you bait your opponent into interacting with you, when maybe it wouldn't be the best for them to use their effect, because they can negate something you would prefer to resolve. The fact that they use that hand effect, or graveyard interaction, or what it may be, that just turned on your other cards in your hand, allows you to sequence your plays in such a way where you can pick apart the field in a much more clean way. So whilst this deck is not playing Thrust, it is playing Isuna, and Isuna, Ripper and Lupus all get better when your opponent has activated a monster effect. So in a similar sense with Thrust, you're just hoping your opponent is interacting with you, thus making your K9 cards that much better. Then I have 3 copies of Mitsurugi Prayers, 3 copies of Pre-Preparation of Rites, and 1 copy of Mitsurugi Mirror so we can actually activate the pre-prep. As this deck cannot make King of the Fair Limbs without already accessing the Mitsu engine, I wanted to play more starter cards to actually see the Mitsu cards. So in a world where they for example ban King of the Fair Limbs on an upcoming ban list, or they just hit the Ryseal card so hard there's no real incentive to play Ryseal Mitsurugi anymore, you could just play more Mitsu cards hoping to draw them. Not everything has to be a 1-card combo that bridges into every single engine in your deck. It is completely reasonable to actually having to draw your 1-card Mitsu starter along with your 1-card K9 starter perhaps. Or if you don't, you just draw non-engine to where the Mitsus on their own might be enough, or you're able to dig into the K9 cards thanks to these rank 4 or rank 8 plays you're gonna do. And as I mentioned with Droll and Lockbird kinda exiting the metagame, it is fine to play these cards which are weak into Droll, because your opponent's not gonna have Droll in their deck in game 1, very likely. This is of course format dependent, but at the current moment people aren't maining Droll. And not everyone is even side decking it, particularly if we're gonna get a ban list where they hit Ryseal, and Droll just ends up not lining up well into the metagame. So we play pre-prep just because it's 1 more starter card for your deck. That's also a +1 in grabbing you a mirror. Even though the mirror is not the best card on its own, as it doesn't do anything, it just extends your plays further. It is really nice being able to bring back any ritual from the graveyard. And can give you more plays by triggering that last ritual monster when you tribute it for mirror's effect. But that is it for the Mitsu cards. For the K9s, I have 3 copies of Izuna. Unfortunately, Izuna is not very good against Yummy, as they activate pretty much nothing in the graveyard or hand when they do their combo, so drawing this card going second into them doesn't really accomplish anything. But if you play against something like Draco Tail or Vanquish Soul K9, the Izuna can be a pretty good hand trap. Or you can just save the Izuna for your turn, using it like a starter card to access your K9 engine, after you bait a hand or graveyard interaction with the Mitsus. Additionally, should your opponent use something like an Ash Blossom or Joy Spring at any point in your combo when you go first, the Izuna is just a great punish that helps you get into your K9 package, which can give you enough interruptions to fend off your opponent, even though your Mitsu engine might have gotten completely interrupted. 1 Lupus to go with the Izunas, 3 Yokel, and 1 Lantern. This is pretty standard for the K9 package. A lot of the time in this deck you don't actually need to normal summon a monster. As such, you can normal summon Yokel in a pinch. So even when you don't draw the level 5 to pair with Yokel, being able to start with your Mitsus, your opponent hand traps you at any point, you go normal summon Yokel, add Izuna, you summon Izuna, dumping Lupus, making Ripper, search a Lantern, and set the rank up, and make another rank 5 or maybe IP into some link play in your opponent's turn. These cards are just very good to either start your engine or to extend it. And obviously if you open something like Yokel and Izuna, you can just start by making the Ripper and then you're completely safe against their Ash Blossom and Joy Spring on your Mitsu cards. As such, I think this is a perfect engine to play with the Mitsurugis, and for their spells I also play 1 copy of Case and 1 copy of Forced Release. Once we get Doom of Dimensions and we get the new K9 monster, which is sort of like a Neo Space connector, if any of you remember that from 2018. That gives the K9 package a really good 1-card starter, and I could see something like Fiendsmith K9 being a very strong deck, as then you can play 3 copies of Case. Case is a 1-card starter that gives you your entire K9 engine, and you get to look at your opponent's hand, so you can see if they have something like Nib, to where you can make a Caesar. Or if they don't have Nib, you can just play into a Nib, because you know they don't have it. But for right now, since I'm also playing a large Mitsurugi package, I decided to only go with 1 copy of Case. And since Case is not a 1-card starter on its own, unless your opponent hand traps you, I don't think I want to play more copies of Case in this deck, as it's fairly unlikely for you to draw Case and a level 5, so you can summon it with Yokel. I would rather draw the Mitsus before the K9s, unless my opponent hand traps me of course. But that's it for the engine cards. For my non-engine, I have 3 copies of Mulcharmy Fuvalos, 3 copies of Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, 3 copies of Infinite Impermanence, and 1 Call by the Grave. As this deck has 2 engines, and the Mitsu engine is quite large, I couldn't fit more non-engine into this deck. There is a consideration of going above 40, as this is 40 cards, and playing something like Ghostbell and Haunted Mansion, or perhaps more of the Mulcharmies. But personally, this deck is built for my local metagame, where there's not much Yummy, and as such, I kinda disrespected that matchup, at least for game 1. I think the way this deck is built is way better into Vanquish Soul K9, Draco Tail, or other rogue decks. If you would like to build this deck to beat Yummy, I believe a correct approach would be to cut down on the Mitsurugis slightly, and maybe playing something like Forbidden Droplet in the main deck. Because an issue with Herald of the Arclight is if you activate Mitsurugi Ritual to summon from hand, the monsters from your deck would be banished. And whilst banishing your Mitsus is not the end of the world, because they do trigger when they're banished, you do lose a lot of your resources by having these cards get banished as opposed to going to the graveyard. But in this deck, Droplet would be a pretty good board breaker, as you can dodge cards like Infinite Impermanence on your normal summons, or you can send away prayers or pre-prep, even under Arclights. You could even go further with the board breakers and main deck something like Triple Tactics Thrust, Talents, and maybe a Blackout Laugh to set with it. Then I would consider cutting something like the hand traps from the main deck, and going all out on the board breaker approach. This deck is fairly flexible in how you want to build it, so it just depends on what decks you're trying to beat. But unless you figure out a good way to beat Yummy, I don't think this deck can consistently beat that deck in order to play it at a YCS. I think at best this deck would have a 40-60 matchup against that deck. But perhaps if they ban Arclight on an upcoming Forbidden Limited list, that could change. But that's it for the main deck. For the extra deck, I have one copy of Dynamondo, one IP Masquerena, one SP Little Knight, one Access Code Talker, one Baguska, one Dugaris, one number C101, one Nash Knight, one Ripper, one Chaos Nash Knight, one Zombie Vampire. With this card, assuming your opponent also plays a K9 deck, such as Draco Tail with a K9 package of Izuna, or perhaps Vanquishal K9 with all of the K9 cards, it is fairly likely we actually hit those cards with Zombie Vampire. In my turn 1 combo, if I don't open with K9 and just Mitsu, I go for Dugaris to draw 2, and Zombie Vampire to mill 4. With this, it's fairly likely to hit the K9 cards for your deck, or at least dig into some of your non-engine perhaps. Or if you open with Mitsu and K9, you can still do the Dugaris play to draw 2, or just end on IP Baguska. This way it's kinda awkward for your opponent to play into your board, as anything that's not a link can't really do anything. And if your opponent threatens to make an SP to try to clear your Baguska, you can use IP to make the SP beforehand. Depending on the deck and the situation, they maybe can't get another out to your Baguska. Or you can just let them SP you and then you Murakuma away their entire field. And you can then do things to dodge their SP trying to tag out by linking away your own Murakumo into your own SP, giving you even more disruptions. So you have a lot of flexibility in what you're trying to end on, depending on what you open and the deck you're playing against. One Chaos Tachyon Dragon, one Werewolf, one Typhon, and one Zeus. The extra deck is quite flexible, as such I decided to include these two, which you don't really make that often, but certainly could come up in various game states, as well as the 2 number monsters for Nash Knights with the Chaos package, as this makes your K9s a whole lot better. You could play a Valon, but I think opting not to play the Valon if you play Nash Knight is completely fine, as you already have the effect to suck up a monster, so the Book of Moon effect is not as vital. That's it for the extra deck. For the side deck, I have 3 copies of Droll and Lockbird, 3 copies of Molcharmi Meows, 1 Vosu. Whilst this card locks you into reptiles, if you can Vosu to clear a Liger Dancer and end on something like a Murakumo or just break apart their field, that is still pretty good against the Lunalight deck. You also have various hand traps to try to stop them in their tracks, so I think this is enough against the Lunalight deck to where you don't need to side Artifact Lancia. So unless you're expecting a lot of Malice, I think this is perfectly fine. You could argue playing Lancia because it's good against Malice, Crystron K9, and Lunalight. But again, that depends on your local metagame and what you're trying to beat with this deck. But I think the Vosu is a pretty good inclusion regardless, to just beat those tower cards. 3 copies of Nibiru the Primal Being. Nib as always is very good when you go first. You can just pass on pretty much any field that is slightly okay, and Nib can usually get you there. It is very difficult to play through 2, 3 or maybe 4 interruptions with a Nib safe in hand. Whatever their negation card for Nib may be, you usually are able to clear that beforehand to get to it, or you can use your other cards to negate the card they're trying to use to negate Nib, for example a Ripper or an Arclight. And with Mitsu deck, if you're able to survive and get to turn 3, your crackback is usually so insane that it doesn't really matter what they have, and a lot of the interactions of the top decks aren't really good into Mitsu. A lot of the time you can dodge the removal with prayers, and Murakumo just clears the way. 1 talent. This was the 15th card in the side deck. It is mainly used for going second, when you're trying to break apart a field. Against some decks the talents can be really good, because you just starting with the Mitsu cards forces their interactions, and then having a Pot of Greed Change of Heart or Forceful Sentry on command can be really good. Against hand trap heavy decks, you could also take this card in when you go first, as then you have a lot of versatility to maybe hit the best card out of their hand, or see what they have and then continue on with your K9s without having fear of something like Nibiru. Talents is also one of those cards I really like in diverse metagames. The fact that you have a lot of different options allows you to usually choose the one that is best for any given situation, and there's very few decks where you put in talents and it doesn't have some type of use. Something like Nib, Droll, or Meows might not be best in the given matchup, and having talents is just one more card that when you take out something like Fuva when you go first, or some of the lesser needed engine cards when you go second, having the talents is just pretty good, and I would probably play more of this if it wasn't limited to one. And I didn't feel like I had enough side deck slots to warrant Thrust with some amount of good targets to set with it, nor did I feel that I could really utilize a Blackout Laugh if I were to draw it. This is not like Lunalight, where you can readily discard the Blackout Laughs, and Thrust grabs you a lot of engine. Thrust actually can't really access your K9 or Mitsu. You only have pre-prep and Chaos Elements, which searches your Yokel, so I don't think Thrust is particularly great in this deck. One copy of Mitsurugi Great Purification, something to side in when you go first, as you're able to negate their breakers, if they have them. This deck doesn't put up any real negates, so having something like a Duster or a Geki can just clear away your field, and you really want to be able to negate those cards with this. Then I have 3 copies of Solemn Judgment. For this deck, I think this is just the safest card to side when you go first, as you want to take out your Fuvaloses. And the Solemn Judgment, similar to Great Purification, can just negate their breakers. Even though this card is not the best against Vanquished Soul K9, I think that matchup is actually fairly good, so I don't feel the need to play Solemn Strike as opposed to Judgment, which is slightly better into that deck. I would rather have Judgment, which is just a better card against the other decks, as you can beat their breakers or their engine. But that is it for the deck profile. If you enjoy my content, make sure to also subscribe to my second channel, linked in the description box down below. There I'll be posting more personalized and exclusive content.